I want to talk about public trust in the FBI. And on this score, there is a small piece of bad news and then also a piece of encouraging news. So the bad news is the result of the trial in Michigan. I'm talking about the trial of Adam Fox and Barry Croft. Let's remember that two of the other defendants, Brandon Caserta and Daniel Harris, were acquitted on the charge of kidnapping Governor Whitmer. And the reason they were acquitted is the jury saw right away that this was a FBI setup. The FBI moved this plot along. The FBI made it happen. It would not have happened without the FBI. Unfortunately, in the retrial of the two guys who got a hung jury, what the government did was they, first of all, they had a kind of a multicultural jury. So they tried to make sure that they had the kind of jury where they'd get a more sympathetic hearing, the government would. And second of all, they got a judge who seemed to be determined to prejudice the jury in favor of a conviction. In fact, instructed the jury that it doesn't really matter if the FBI sort of set this up or even moved the plot along, as long as there is a willingness on the part of these guys to do it, as long as they talked about doing it, and as long as they expected to do it, and as long as they were in on it, that's enough to secure a conviction. Now, again, you're hoping that there's one member of the jury who goes, no, I'm not going for this. This is basically nonsense. We have the government here orchestrating the crimes that they then turn around and bust. But unfortunately, there wasn't such a person on the jury. And so these two guys got convicted. They're going to get very severe sentences for something that the FBI, in effect, made happen. But I see from Rasmussen, and the Rasmussen survey here is supported by other surveys, that all the rhetoric we hear from Merrick Garland about the FBI is above politics, the FBI is without fear or favor, the FBI is no one is above the law, we're very even-handed. The American people are not buying it. And not only are the American people not buying it, independents and Democrats are not buying it either. Do you agree or disagree with this statement? There is a group of politicized thugs at the top of the FBI who are using the FBI as Joe Biden's personal Gestapo. I mean, this is framing the question in the most extreme way. Not just, do you think that the FBI is somewhat prejudiced? No. Do you think that the FBI is like the KGB? Do you think they're like the Nazis? Here's the agree. GOP, not all that surprising, 64% agree. So a substantial majority. Let's remember, though, honey, I think the GOP, I'm actually surprised at 64 because for decades, we're the party of law and order. And so by and large, we're deferential to the FBI. So getting this number over 50, I think, is an accomplishment. Anyway, independents, 47%, a near majority agree, and Democrats 30%. This to me is really telling. Almost 1 in 3 Democrats agree that the FBI is now a thug operation. So now, the FBI doesn't help itself because instead of trying to come back to the middle, recognize that it needs agents who have different types of political views, it needs to stop this kind of combat operation against conservatives, against Republicans. I think the reason independents and Democrats even have decent numbers here is not just because they're observing the situation, but they also realize when you have a rogue agency, everybody's vulnerable. Once you have rogue cops that are essentially with badges, thugs with badges, I've called them before and I repeat it now, then they can go after you on other reasons as well. They can frame you for crimes that you haven't committed. They can arrest you without cause. And they're relying really on what is now more obvious, a fairly corrupted judicial system. I don't know if it's corrupted everywhere, but it's corrupted in key places, including the nation's capital. If you look at the FBI manual, which talks about how you recognize violent extremists and militia enemies of the state, they give you several indications of how you can find these guys. First, they're likely to be talking about the Second Amendment. Think about that. If you talk about the Second Amendment, that's a sign that you might be a violent militiaman. Number two, They could be sporting the Gadsden flag, which is an historical flag representing really limited government and gun rights. They use Revolutionary War imagery. By the way, I've used Revolutionary War imagery in at least 2, if not more, of my films. Use Revolutionary War imagery. You're obviously a potential enemy of the state. They display the Liberty Tree, which, by the way, was a famous elm tree in Boston. In 1765, American colonists staged their first act of defiance against the British at that tree. So these symbols of the American Revolution, or the Betsy Ross flag, which again is Revolutionary War imagery going back to the 13 colonies and the original calls for revolution. And so these symbols of the very creation of America are now being used by the FBI to identify people who, in their view, are anti-American, un-American, enemies of the state. Of course, the real enemy of the state today is the FBI itself.